The fog does not move here. It hangs between the towering pines like a damp, gray shroud that swallows sound. Deep in the heart of this silence, the iron skeleton of a train rests upon tracks that have long since surrendered to the earth. A century of rain has turned the steel to a deep, bruised orange. Vines have wrapped around the chassis, their thick, knotted stems forcing iron plates apart as if the forest itself is slowly digesting the machine. Every window is a jagged, empty eye peering into nothing. Inside, the seats have collapsed into piles of wet, pulpy rot. The air is heavy, tasting of minerals and stagnant water. There is no movement. No bird lands on the rusted roof. No wind disturbs the stillness. The carriage is a tomb for a travel that ended decades ago, a forgotten relic caught in the slow, grinding machinery of nature. It sits motionless, a ghost of iron and memory, sinking deeper into the soft, mossy floor of the woods while the fog continues to press against its hollow frame, erasing its history one day at a time. A snap of a branch broke the silence. A man pushed through the dense undergrowth, his boots crushing dry leaves into the mud. He reached the rusted carriage and paused, his breath forming a brief, white cloud in the damp air. He clicked a flashlight on. The beam cut a sharp, white path through the gloom, illuminating thick layers of grime on the glass. He reached out, gripped the iron handle, and pulled. The door groaned, protesting with a long, metallic shriek that echoed through the trees before giving way. He stepped inside. His boots crunched on piles of shattered glass and rotted wood. The light swung across the interior, exposing water-stained ceilings and seats that had disintegrated into dark, fibrous heaps. He ignored the stench of stagnant earth. He walked to the center of the carriage, pulled a tape measure from his belt, and snapped it open. The metallic clack of the tape was a sudden, sharp intrusion. He held the end against a wall, pulled the steel ribbon taut, and began to record the dimensions. His movements were precise, deliberate, and entirely focused on the space that everyone else had left for dead. The morning light struggled to pierce the canopy when he returned. He did not hesitate. He gripped a heavy blade and swung into the wall of green. Vines that had held the carriage for decades tore away with a wet, ripping sound. He hacked rhythmically, the blade biting deep into the knotted stems until the metal skin of the train was finally exposed. Once the exterior was clear, he moved inside to face the rot. He shoveled the pulpy, waterlogged wood into buckets, his muscles straining with every lift. The smell of decay was thick, but he did not stop. He heaved the heavy, sodden debris toward the door and dumped it into the mud. He returned for more. He scraped the floorboards, tearing out the fungus-covered layers that had been trapped for years. The air in the carriage grew thin and sharp as the weight of the past was hauled away. He worked without rhythm, driven by a singular, grinding intensity. By the time the final bucket hit the ground outside, the carriage was empty. He stood in the center, chest heaving, his hands raw and stained. The interior was now nothing but a hollow shell of iron, stripped bare, waiting for the first sign of new life. He set the heavy tank down on the floor, the metal clinking against the base. He checked the pressure gauge, his fingers steady despite the lingering fatigue in his arms. He pulled on a leather mask, dimming the world to a narrow, protected field of vision. He clicked the torch. A sharp hiss preceded a brilliant, blinding white flare. The light washed over the rusted, jagged gaps in the iron walls, exposing the structural weakness of the frame. He pressed the nozzle to the seam. Sparks showered outward like falling stars, dancing into the shadows and dissipating against the cold metal floor. He moved the torch slowly, a steady, deliberate motion that fused the steel plates to the carriage skeleton. The smell of ozone and heated metal filled the space, sharp and clean. Every pass of the torch was a promise of permanence. He stopped to check the bond, tapped the new plate with a hammer, and heard a solid, resonant ring that replaced the hollow rattle of decay. He adjusted his stance, leaned back into the work, and resumed the rhythmic clanging. With each strike, the carriage felt less like a ruin and more like a fortress. The iron ribs were finally holding their own weight again, fortified against the slow pressure of the forest. The heavy work transitioned into a phase of surgical precision. He stood before the jagged, uneven window frames, measuring the void with a steel rule. The iron was warped by time, demanding exact cuts for the glass to seat correctly. He hammered the edges flat, then lifted the first pane into place. It slid home with a satisfying click, sealing the interior against the humid forest draft. He moved to the walls next. He carried in planks of oak, their grain rich and golden against the harsh, gray metal of the carriage. He positioned each panel, drilling the pilot holes with a rhythmic, high-pitched whine that cut through the silence of the woods. He drove the screws deep, anchoring the warm wood to the cold, iron ribs. The contrast was instant. Where there was once only flaking rust and damp shadow, there was now the smooth, inviting surface of polished timber. He stepped back, wiping sawdust from his forehead, and looked at the intersection of materials. The raw, imposing strength of the train frame now acted as a frame for the refined interior. He pressed his palm against the oak, feeling its stability. The space had stopped being a relic of the past and was becoming a deliberate, crafted environment. He reached for the next panel, his movements fluid, the transformation taking hold with every board he secured. The final oak panel clicked into place, locking the last segment of the wall. He stood in the center of the carriage, the air still thick with the heavy, musty odor of decades. He grabbed a broom and a heavy-duty vacuum, moving with a speed that signaled the end of the rough construction. He swept the corners, pulling out the last of the rotted wood fragments and dried moss that had clung to the floorboards. He opened the new glass windows wide, letting a cross breeze scour the interior. The stagnant, damp earth smell fought back, clinging to the iron, but he persisted. He wiped down the iron ribs with a clean cloth and a solvent, stripping away the final layers of grime. Then, he brought in the cedar planks. He began installing the trim, the wood yielding a sharp, fragrant dust as he cut it to size. The scent hit the air almost immediately, clean and piercing. It cut through the dampness, replacing the cold, earthy rot with the warm, resinous perfume of the forest timber. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding, testing the atmosphere of the space. The transition was complete. The smell of decay was gone, replaced by the crisp, invigorating presence of living wood. He set his tools aside, listening to the silence of the carriage. It no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a home waiting for its first breath. The carriage remained silent and cool, the air still carrying a lingering chill from the forest outside. He moved to the center of the floor, where he had cleared a space for the heart of the home. He began laying the stone hearth, heavy blocks clicking into place with solid grounding weight. He worked the mortar into the joints, his hands moving with rhythmic, practiced efficiency. He built the chimney flue with care, ensuring the draw would be perfect. He placed an iron grate inside the finished hearth, then gathered dry cedar kindling and split logs. He struck a match. The flame caught the edge of the wood, curling upward. He watched, breath held, as the fire licked at the bark. It blossomed, spreading quickly until the logs began to crackle and pop. A rush of heat surged outward, hitting his face and pushing back the damp, stagnant air of the woods. The iron ribs of the carriage began to lose their icy bite. He added a larger log, the orange glow casting long, dancing shadows against the fresh oak panels. The cold was retreating. For the first time in a century, the carriage radiated a pulse of life. He sat back on his heels, watching the fire stabilize. The warmth now a tangible, defiant barrier against the dark, encroaching forest beyond the glass. The warmth from the hearth now anchored the room, turning the metallic shell into a sanctuary. He stepped to the bed frame, unrolling a heavy wool blanket that softened the sharp lines of the furniture. He smoothed the fabric with a steady hand, checking the weight and texture against the crisp air. He moved to the kitchen counter, his boots silent on the new floor. He reached for the switch tucked beneath the overhead cabinets. A warm golden glow bloomed across the oak surfaces, reflecting softly in the modern glass of the window panes. The harsh shadows of the carriage vanished, replaced by a soft, amber light that blurred the boundary between the interior and the encroaching forest dark. He adjusted the dimmer, watching the light pool over the grain of the wood. The transformation hit its peak. The industrial decay was gone, replaced by a controlled, inviting atmosphere. He stepped back to survey the space. Every surface hummed with the quiet intention of his design. The metallic skeleton had disappeared behind the comfort of oak and light. He placed a ceramic cup on the counter, the steam curling upward into the glow. He stood in the center, breathing in the quiet, absolute stillness of a home reclaimed from the wild. He pushed the heavy door open, stepping out from the golden interior onto the newly laid terrace. The air outside was sharp, carrying the scent of damp moss and pine, a stark contrast to the cedar-warmed air he left behind. He reached up to the exterior frame, toggling the switch for the deck lights. Instantly, a bright, precise glow erupted along the perimeter of the carriage. The light cut through the gloom, turning the dark, towering trees into a wall of deep, textured shadow. It was a defiant display of geometry against the chaos of the woods. From the vantage point of the deck, the carriage no longer looked like a relic of decay. It stood as a beacon, a polished sanctuary carved out of the forest floor. The light caught the edges of the modern glass, reflecting the surrounding pines and shimmering, distorted fragments. He walked to the edge of the terrace, his hand resting on the smooth, planed railing. He looked out at the vast, impenetrable dark beyond the reach of his lamps. The contrast was absolute. Where once there was only the stillness of rot, there was now a triumphant, illuminated refuge. He stood motionless, watching the light hold its ground against the weight of the ancient timber, the structure radiating a steady, unwavering power. The first light of dawn broke through the canopy, turning the heavy forest fog into a shimmering, pale veil. The man sat on the terrace, the warmth of the ceramic mug seeping into his palms, a steady contrast to the chill of the morning air. He watched the light reclaim the woods, the shadows of the night receding as the sun climbed higher. The fog drifted past the glass panels, swirling in slow, ethereal ribbons. He took a long, slow breath, watching the steam from his coffee dissipate into the cool breeze. The silence of the forest was no longer isolating. It felt like a shared understanding between the structure and the trees. He turned his head, surveying the transformation one last time, measuring the clean lines of the deck against the wild, unkempt growth beyond. There was no more metal to scrap, no more decay to clear. The work was complete. He rose from his seat, the floorboards beneath his feet solid and sound. With a final glance at the retreating mist, he turned away from the edge. He stepped through the threshold, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft, final click. He walked back into the core of the sanctuary, leaving the wilderness outside, fully enveloped by the quiet, golden warmth of the home he had built from the ruins.